Hey, it's Greg.
And Ariana.
We know that to address climate, we need to build a lot of large infrastructure really quickly. One of the biggest infrastructure projects in the country is California's State Water Project.
The 700-mile system of aqueducts is one of the most ambitious and highly engineered water delivery systems on the planet. And it's about to get a new extension.
The Delta Conveyance Tunnel is Governor Gavin Newsom's proposal for a 45-mile underground tube that would tap fresh water from its source in the north and carry it beneath a vast wetland to farms and cities in Southern California.
Ruth Dusseault is a local reporter in the San Francisco Bay Area who compiled a series of field reports about the Delta Tunnel. Today, we're bringing you that series, called Tunnel Vision, a production of Bay City News in partnership with Northern California Public Media. You can find the full report at localnewsmatters.org. And now, here's Tunnel Vision.
This is a local story about a global issue, the future of water. Here in the Bay and around the American West, the future of water has a lot to do with capturing as much as possible. Managing how that water is used is the job of the State Water Resources Control Board. The Water Board is the office where one goes to get a permit to use public water, and they must use that water right for the benefit of all Californians. I'd like to welcome my guest, Felicia Marcus. Felicia, you're now the Landreth Fellow at Stanford's Water in the West program. But tell me, when you were the chair of the Water Board, did you learn more about water or about people?
I always say I'm more of an ecosystem manager than an ecosystem manager because I see the people. You can sit through a hearing and you can see, let's just say, 6 different stories in people's heads from the same thing that they're listening to.
Who are the stakeholders in the Delta?
I think the issue with stakeholders is, you have very good people who have fears and concerns. You have agriculture and urban users who rely on exports, who are afraid that it's going to be cut off for environmental purposes because of sea level rise, because of disruption in the Delta. You have the farmers in the Delta who are terrified that they will be left behind and salinity will be allowed to intrude into the Delta and they won't be able to farm anymore. You have indigenous people, subsistence fishers, environmentalists who are worried that it will become just a more efficient way to drain the Delta dry. And so there's competition over every drop of water, but it doesn't play out as fighting for water. It plays out as those bad people want to hurt my interest.
So let's listen to the first field report where we hear from those stakeholders. The Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta is hidden in the valley east of San Francisco. It's an estuary that spans over 1,000 square miles, almost the size of Anchorage. It's a giant geological depression where surface water meets groundwater. It was once a sea of river grasses with islands of trees, like the Florida Everglades, but landlocked. It's where snowmelt pools from the Sierra Nevada before flowing through the Carquinez Strait to marry with the salty sea around San Francisco. Together, they make bugs, the insect-based protein for an historically prodigious wetland ecosystem. The water that flows from the Delta is fresh. Its strong outward current keeps salt water in the bay, away from the intake to the state delivery system, and away from the farms that exist in the Delta. With the impacts of climate change and sea level rise, fears are growing that a catastrophic event like a major storm or an earthquake could draw seawater into the Delta, and that could destroy native ecosystems and contaminate water throughout the state, threatening farmland and leaving 27 million people without water for months. Several California governors since the 1960s have attempted to engineer a way for fresh water to travel across, around, or under the Delta. The proposed tunnel is a 45-mile underground gravity-fed canal that will tap the Sacramento River, the biggest tributary, just before it reaches the Delta. When the river rises above capacity, it could draw 6,000 cubic feet of water per second and bring it directly to the water agencies that buy it through the state delivery system. Of the 27 water contractors that would benefit from the tunnel, the biggest are the Kern County Water Agency that buys water for fruit and nut growers in San Joaquin Valley, and the Metropolitan Water Agency that supplies Los Angeles. Cities, farmers, tribes, and salmon all hold a stake in the waters of the Delta. When I spoke to some of them, I found some unusual alliances. Farmers and environmentalists are normally on opposite ends of the water debate, but in the Delta, they're aligned. So are tribes and commercial fisheries, who are joining to defend salmon habitat. Salmon have become the telltale for the changes in the way the water flows. Normally, the strong flow of the Sacramento River carries baby salmon hundreds of miles from their shallow mountain creche into the Pacific like the arms of a mother.
My name is Scott Artis, and I'm the executive director of the Golden State Salmon Association.
I first met Scott in the spring at San Francisco's Fisherman's Wharf. He was speaking out along with other fisheries after Gavin Newsom had canceled salmon fishing season for a second year in a row due to decreased populations.
And everybody's heard the stories of being able to walk across rivers in California because the salmon was so thick and had millions of returns. And now we're fighting. We're just trying to get 200,000 back into the Sacramento River system. And that is sad.
California's climate has always careened between flood and drought, and the Delta's unique geological features had accommodated that flux by transfiguring from river to floodplain to grassland. And it did so in concert with the transitory life cycle of salmon, which migrate back and forth from river to sea.
Because you can imagine, as a tiny baby fish, floodplains that would allow water and big storm events to spread out and calm down. So these fish could go from the middle of the river, but when the flows are so heavy that they would get blasted out to the ocean or killed before they're ready, they could move off to the side to shelter in some of the lower flow areas.
But industrialism loves constancy, and the cultivation of the Delta in the 20th century required controlling that flux. Water was channeled by levees, rivers were separated from floodplains. Following recent multi-year megadroughts, salmon populations have dwindled.
In 2022 and 2021, you'd have about 5,000, which is already very small. That's why they're threatened on the endangered species list. But in 2023, it was 106 to the upper Sacramento River that those spring run returned.
106,000.
No, 106. And that is not 106,000. That is 106 individual fish. And so that's what we're talking about. A complete just obliteration. What caused those? The catalyst is that the state failed to require adequate temperature protections for salmon eggs. And so as a result, lethal hot water caused by excessive and unsustainable water diversions, largely just were sent to export crops, which has dramatically increased over the last year.
More water diversions mean shallower rivers and warmer temperatures, and salmon eggs need cold water. California's San Joaquin Valley, that flat bowl in the middle of the state below the Delta, once produced a myriad of crops that could be fallowed or allowed to rest during dry spells. According to Scott, the valley produced 500,000 acres of almonds in 1996, but that production has tripled to 1.5 million acres today.
So now they have trees that need water all year round. So there's constant water diversions that need to happen.
I went to hear from the water contractors that were dependent on the state deliveries and on the proposed tunnel. On my way to Sacramento, I stopped at a remote duck hunting preserve in the Suisun Marsh, where the Delta meets the bay. I wanted to see an intact wetland and get a glimpse of what the pre-industrial landscape looked like. I spent long minutes listening to birdsong. In Sacramento, I sat down with Jennifer Pierre, the general manager for the state water contractors, the agencies in support of the tunnel.
You may hate fish and you may hate the environment, and let's just assume someone does, but our water supply is so intrinsically linked to the health of the environment that we must care about it.
We spoke about the 2009 Delta Reform Act, which set in place the co-equal goals of economic and environmental benefits.
Well, we supported the bill. That plan was originally contemplated as just a way of complying with the Endangered Species Act to permit the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, which was the tunnel original, idea.
How might the tunnel help to save the Delta?
Building a tunnel or not is not going to save the Delta, The tunnel in and of itself is not the issue that is going to cause a climate change mitigation or adaptation response. That's just for our water supply.
Jennifer explained to me that the Department of Water Resources will only open the tunnel when the waters of the Sacramento are excessively high during wet season.
Anytime the flows in the Sacramento River are exceeding a certain amount, and anytime we are in what's called excess conditions, we would have an ability to divert some portion or the full 6,000 CFS into the tunnel.
That's 6,000 cubic feet per second. Is that excess water part of the state's water rights?
It's under DWR's water right, and each of our participating contractors are contracted with DWR to participate in the project, and so they would be the recipients of the water made available in the tunnel.
And is the tunnel water fully appropriated?
Yes.
What some of you might not be aware of is that there are approximately 110 Indian tribes in the state of California.
Lester Maston is a native rights lawyer. He worked on a seminal case in 2014 that restored federal recognition and land rights to 17 California tribes. He's talking about a water rights treaty dating back to the 19th century.
The tribes have a federal right to use the surface and groundwaters that are located above, below, and which flow through their reservations. Those water rights are governed by federal and tribal law, not by state law. Let me repeat that. Those rights are governed by federal and tribal law, not by state law. And for most tribes within the state, that date is March 1st, 1853.
1914 was the year the Water Resources Control Board began issuing licenses to take water.
I met Russell Van Lobensel's on my way back from Sacramento at his home in the Delta near the city of Clarksburg. He told me his grandfather was one of the first farmers to buy land in the Delta in the 1850s. Under a federal Swampland Reclamation Act, one of his first jobs was to build levees and reclaim the land from the swamp.
So people who took water before 1914, it's argued that the Water Resources Control Board cannot curtail.
So they were grandfathered in.
Grandfathered in or not subject to the jurisdiction of the Water Resources Control Board.
How many farmers are pre-1914?
Almost the whole Delta. I mean,
They're all century farmers.
No, it doesn't have to be the same family. It's not based upon person, it's based upon location of property. Most of the Delta is riparian.
Right, so if you live next to the water, then you have right to take that water.
Riparian being by a natural water course.
They don't pay for water at all, they get it for free.
Well, water's a two-edged
as long as it's beneficial use.
Yeah.
The farmers in the Delta are against the tunnel. They feel their water rights are baked in because they were there before the creation of the Water Board. 2/3 of the Delta is agricultural. When I drove south through the farms along the Sacramento River, I saw a landscape that has turned into a surreal constellation of islands, an upside-down logic of farms that sit below sea level, surrounded by high-levee roads. I've seen them from the air. They look like giant lily pads. I drove deeper into a nostalgic agrarian landscape. I drove past pioneer ghost towns drenched in dust, steel bridges that date back to the Eisenhower era. Drawbridge operators waved with their cigarettes. I stopped in the town of Hood, the spot where the tunnel is supposed to start, to get a local perspective. I found a seat at the Supply Bar and Grill, and there I met a friendly mortician named Mark Cordero. His friend Don used to work at the Campbell Soup Factory in Sacramento. It opened in 1947 and closed in 2012.
They were number one. You got to understand, California back in the day, we were the number one for everything. Tomatoes, doesn't matter. Every fruit and vegetable you got, we were number one back in the day. You go back to the 70s and 80s, we were number one. We're like probably number 10 now. It just so sucks right now.
Away from the bar, I met Kurt Hagen, who used to work with the California Fish and Wildlife Department.
The big fear, Ruth, is that once the plumbing is in place, the history tells us that those valves just keep getting opened more and more, and then the the proponents of water export are at the same time trying to change the rules. They'll look to try to move that needle of measurement to something that fits their scenario more. So that's why we're all distrustful of some talk of only drafting water when it's, I really don't think there is any such thing as excess.
There will likely be no such thing as excess water in California's climate future. By the end of this century, the Sierra snowpack is projected to have a 50% loss.
The tunnel will not be used very much.
John Garamendi is a Delta farmer and senior statesman who now represents the district in Congress.
Because it cannot operate unless you override the existing water rights, existing protections for endangered species. You just can't pump. And so why are you building this thing? Why are you going to spend, $30 billion when you can't use it?
Garamendi feels that once the tunnel is built, the state will change the laws.
All of these rights are subject to political reality. And so the California Endangered Species Act could be overridden or otherwise modified so that water would be diverted to where the voters are, Southern California, and or the San Joaquin Valley.
I'm trying to determine if the tunnel is being built for the greater good.
Isn't that the history of California? Isn't that the way that the Owens Valley was destroyed? Isn't that the way that before the environmental movement, the Sacramento San Joaquin River habitat was destroyed? The salmon? That's exactly the argument that's been made. For the greater good, we're going to destroy. For the greater good, the hydraulic mines in the Mother Lode were created. Never mind the destruction of the delta and the rivers themselves. For the greater good.
Felicia, we just heard from some of the stakeholders, and it's obvious they all need water for different purposes. You've spent a lot of your professional life making judgments about who gets to benefit from the waters of California. Would you agree that the fish populations are often last in line behind cities and farms?
Certainly, there have been times we haven't left enough water in the system at important times of year. During, for example, the severe drought in the teens, when I was there, we waived certain fish standards because it was just such a desperate drought, and we were trying to navigate and sort of split the baby, as it were, in a way and we cut it too close. In many ways, no one sent us a thank you note. That's not why you do it. But we did cut it too close, and since then, it's been almost routine to waive environmental standards at the first sign of any pressure on the system.
Will there be losers?
There are always losers when there's any change. Whoever sees the change will be perceived as losers. The fish and wildlife and indigenous people and communities that are facing, for example, repeated algae blooms where they can't go in the water, their animals get sick, their kids could get sick. They feel that they've been losers all along, and that it's the role of government to help them.
It also seems like farms will eventually be fallowed.
Yeah, and farms will be fallowed. We won't lose farming in California, in the Delta or otherwise, but farms will be fallowed because it's either expanded beyond what the system can bear, and within the Delta, some of it may go for restoration. The one thing that we can't handle in the future is folks who come in and it's not one drop and not 1 inch, because people are proud farmers, but they see the first loss, even if it's for ecosystem restoration, as the camel's nose under the tent. And that doesn't create an atmosphere where you can figure out how everybody gets better together.
We're about to listen to the second segment where we walk through the process of how this tunnel will be built. But you had once mentioned to me that a bypass for water around the tunnel was part of the original plan for the state delivery system back in the 60s.
Yeah. In theory, interesting thing, the tunnel project, which was originally a peripheral canal project, has been re-envisioned and changed a lot over time. I think originally the thought was, let's just take the water up at the point of the bigger river, because then you're not going to have this problem of having pumps at the middle, essentially the middle of a delta, reversing flows, drawing in fish, whether smelt or confusing salmon smolts, because it's completely changing the natural outward flow of the water.
You mean the Bethany pump station near Stockton?
That the idea would be that you would bypass these horrible pumps and you would take it in the place that they should have built it in the first place. More recently, and this is the idea, has been a dual system where you would pump from the Sacramento when it was bad for fish down at the pumps. You would do it at the pumps when it was helpful for keeping the tidal inflow of salinity at bay, and that you could actually manage the system and toggle between the two. So in theory, the problem is not an engineering problem. The problem is a lack of trust.
Well, there certainly is an engineering perspective for constructing a 45-mile tunnel under a wetland. Let's hear it in this next report. The controversial $20 billion Delta Conveyance Tunnel would bypass the environmentally threatened Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta and deliver fresh water to farms and cities in Central and Southern California. Although it's been contested at every step, the project is slowly inching forward. Out of the 27 water agencies that buy water through aqueducts and canals, none have said yes to funding the tunnel's construction, but 18 have funded its research and design. That brings us to this person.
I'm Steve Manassian. I'm the chief engineer for the Delta Conveyance Design and Construction Authority.
Steve oversees the whole operation, but when I talked to him, I really wanted to learn about the main piece of equipment, the tunnel boring machine. At the peak of construction, there will be 4 of them running at once. From what I understand, the machine will be lowered piece by piece down like a 200-foot shaft and then reassembled. Its face is like a drill head, the circular shape of a bank vault door, but with the diameter of a school bus.
It's more like 2 school buses, but that's okay.
So its body begins with a single ring that can be added onto for miles? How many miles?
A total of 45 miles, but that's in 4 different reaches. So the shortest reach is 8 miles, the longest reach is 14 miles.
The operation done by a tunnel boring machine is more like arthroscopic surgery than open heart surgery. The land will not be cut and splayed open to insert the tunnel. It'll all be done using a series of 10 deep holes where operators can reach the tunnel boring machine as it passes underground from shaft to shaft.
Even the 14-mile one, which is the longest one, we will have 2 intermediate shafts, maintenance shafts. So if something happens, they can always come to that.
So it's like a manhole.
Giant manhole.
How big is the hole?
The excavated diameter, I think they're 70 feet or 65 feet, and the finished is 36 feet.
So the first drill head will be lowered from a crane straddling a shaft near the city of Stockton, right?
Low Roberts to Bethany Pump Station. That's a 14-mile one, so that's the one we're going to do first.
So at the bottom of the shaft, a giant drill head will be pivoted to the northeast in the direction of the Sacramento River.
Yes.
Each drill head has hydraulic legs that it uses to push itself forward.
Yes. We call it cutter head, by the way.
Its flat cutter head will lacerate the alluvium soils, the clay, the sand, the gravel, underneath the pressure of maybe 200 feet of earth?
About 200 feet.
I'm picturing a slow-moving sandworm. The cutter head spews water and foam and then swallows the earth down an auger throat to an esophagus conveyor belt that carries the dirt to its tail, where it's elevated up the shaft to an open air pile.
We don't inject it into the ground. We inject it into where it's actually come in the machine already. Think of it this way. When you eat your food, your saliva stays in your mouth. It doesn't go outside. You don't spit it out. You don't spit on your food and then eat it. Same concept.
So it is like a digestive enzyme.
Right, exactly. Whatever you add, we usually add water mostly and a little bit of biodegradable conditioners.
So up the shaft comes raw earth, and down the shaft goes precast cement ring sections that are carried by rail down the belly of the beast to the head, where they're lifted by a robot that snaps them into a new ring section.
Yes, 8 pieces makes one ring in our case.
So the machine advances, one ring after another. The hydraulic arms on the cutter head retract and grab each new ring and press forward, right?
Mm-hmm.
It moves 40 feet a day, 2 miles a year, beneath the levees and the farms, building the concrete tunnel as it goes.
Yes.
Steve has used these machines to dig stormwater and transportation tunnels all over the world. Abu Dhabi, New York. The operation takes 2 teams. One stays on the surface, and another crew takes the elevator down the shaft, hundreds of feet below ground, to maintain and operate the machine for 10-hour shifts. Tell me a little bit about what it's like to be down there. What is it like to be so far below the ground? What does it sound like?
On a hard rock machine, when you get closer to the cutter head, it's quite noisy, like a jackhammer type noisy. So you definitely have to wear earmuffs. But in a soft ground machine, it's not noisy because you're just cutting soil. It's pretty soft. But what you will hear is the humming of the electric motors and the hydraulic pumps. It's kind of like,
What's time like?
You lose sense of time. You don't know. You can't look around. There's no sun, there's no daylight or nightlight. It's the same. And you won't know whether it's 10 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, or 1 a.m. You won't know that. You won't even know whether it's January or August. You won't know. You won't know where you are. You're isolated from the rest of the world. Although you may be in San Francisco or in New York. It's a very unusual feeling in a good way.
Why is it in a good way?
Because for one thing, nobody can harm you. That's it. You don't have animals, you don't have crime, you don't have any of that. You don't have rain or snow or hurricanes, nothing.
Do you feel closer to nature when you're down there?
I personally do. I mean, you are down to earth, right? Excuse the pun. You are part of Earth, especially in some of the deep tunnels, like in New York. Ours was 900 feet deep.
I would feel like I was in outer space.
Yes, that's how it feels. I mean, I've never been in space, but this is probably the closest thing to space. It's a different environment.
Will there be any vibrations on the surface?
No, you won't feel it. First of all, we're on soft ground. And second of all, we're more than 100 feet deep. You won't feel it.
What about the fish?
The fish won't feel it.
In the water, they won't feel it?
The water dampens it. Anywhere I've worked in the world, we've never had trouble with marine life.
The California Department of Water Resources says it will only open the tunnel during high water events, rainy winters and peak snowmelts. The department approved the tunnel's environmental impact report just days before Christmas in 2023, allowing the authority to seek permits. But the move was followed by a barrage of lawsuits from environmental groups and local water agencies, saying that it violated the Environmental Quality Act. Recently, the tunnel engineers started to dig core samples to find out what kind of soils are down there, but that was stopped by another lawsuit. Delta tribes and farmers are against it, saying that the tunnel is a threat to their historic water rights. There's also a concern that the construction will harm the environment and disrupt cultural landmarks. In 2019, Congress designated the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta a National Heritage Area. Small farm villages that date back to the early 20th century still stand as a living archive of California's agrarian architecture. How long will it take to dig a 45-mile tunnel?
First, we're going to launch that machine heading from Lower Roberts south to the Bethany Pump Station. Then at the same time, we're going to be doing the Twin Cities shaft. Then the third machine will start at Lower Roberts and go north to Terminus. The shortest stretch is the Twin Cities site to the Sacramento River, to the intakes, that's going to be launched last. At one given point, all four of them will be tunneling simultaneously.
And what year will that be?
Most likely 2034, 2035.
Yeah.
That's assuming we start in 2032.
Is that the planned time to start?
The actual work will start probably in 2029, 2030, but there's a lot of prep work, getting the roads ready and all that stuff.
Yeah, you're going to have to reinforce the roads and build stronger bridges to handle the trucks.
Yes, then we also have to get the machines manufactured and delivered to the site.
What happens to the soils that get pulled up?
Some of it will be reused throughout the project. Some of it will be used for restoration if they're clean. But the majority of it is going to be stockpiled at Twin Cities and Lower Roberts. And I feel that as an engineer, it would be great resource for the Delta community for later if they want to use it to strengthen the levees 10 or 20, 30 years from now. It's going to be there for them to use it.
So this delta has been so engineered for a century and a half, right? Do you feel like this machine, this tunnel, is part of nature?
Well, it is. I mean, you know, the delta has evolved over the last, even before people showed up. Even if we magically snapped our fingers and it was like it was 300 years ago, but it won't stay that way because things are changing all the time. Anytime you're in a delta situation, whether it's the Mississippi Delta, the Nile Delta, or the Sacramento, the deltas usually sink. It's sinking, and people don't realize it. If you leave it alone, you don't build levees or anything, naturally, as it sinks, the river brings more silts and rebuilds it. But once you build the levees, like we have in the Mississippi, in New Orleans, or in Sacramento, once you do that, then you're not allowing the river to bring the material back. So what we're building is it becomes part of nature. The ground isn't going to know whether we have a tunnel or not.
Felicia, from a management perspective, what kind of decisions need to be made when a project like this wants to get a water permit, if it's the state that's requesting it?
A water right permit is not just some bucket of water. It's not just a number. It is a time, a season, a place, specific place, and a method of diversion, and how much at those times and places. And so in order to do the tunnel project, the state needs to get a change in both the place of diversion, they have to add an additional one, and the method of diversion. And you have to show that the change won't hurt another legal user of water.
Yeah, and they still need to get federal permits, as well as satisfy the California Environmental Quality Act. Then there's all that pre-tunnel construction, upgrading the roads and the bridges to handle the trucks and equipment.
It's going to disrupt these legacy towns and communities. The question is, can you do it without pile drivers going, however many hours a day outside of schools and churches, etc.? What will the vibrations do to some of those over 100-year-old houses? But everything is mitigatable with enough money. Can you make the bridges better and safer and leave the delta with more infrastructure than they had when you started, replacing the bridges? In theory, yes, but you have to do it.
And really, in the end, will the tunnel increase water diversions?
Not necessarily. The theory behind it is that it will mean that they lose less, because with sea level rise, with climate change, and the fact that we're likely to have more frequent and dry years, that there won't be as much water in the system, and that the conflict between fish at the pumps and water diversions is going to get ever stronger. Again, in theory, but you need to have conditions that people believe will be enforced to assure that it's just taking excess water rather than being a more efficient way to drain the delta dry.
The tunnel has been proposed as a solution to a problem that really began 200 years ago, right? We started to change the land through the extraction of its resources. In this last report, we'll take a critical look at how we might restore the delta using the land's memory. Is it possible to reshape it in a way that the ecosystems it supports, including humans, can survive droughts and sea level rise? And should we change the way we see the delta? Almost 200 years ago, Argonauts tore open Sierra mountainsides with water cannons in search of gold. The runoff raised the floor of San Francisco's Bay Delta watershed all the way from Sacramento to the Golden Gate. Around the time of the Civil War, the federal government issued reclamation permits for cheap swampland. Settlers built levees around their farms to dry out the soil enough to take a plow. What flowed from the delta in the 19th century was gold. What flowed from it in the 20th century was food. The treasure of the 21st century is water. Now the state of California says that a tunnel is needed to safely convey water under the delta, that it must secure fresh water for 27 million people from the risk of saltwater contamination due to sea level rise or earthquakes. To understand how the landscape of the delta arrived to such a fragile state and to understand the challenges of its restoration, we have to know what it looked like before industrialism. We have to go back to a time before Europeans arrived. We have to take the history trip.
The history trip. This landscape is like nothing else on Earth and was of that stature historically.
That's Chuck Bonham, director of California's Department of Fish and Wildlife. He's speaking to the State Water Resources Control Board.
A history of species abundance that had grizzly bears and Tulier elk and tens of millions of birds, meandering temporally and spatially complex habitat types, hundreds of creeks, our two biggest rivers crashing in to an estuary that really is unlike any other on the planet except perhaps for the Okavango Delta in Botswana. That's a landscape that was stewarded since the beginning of time by indigenous people, and today sadly doesn't look like what it once was. We know that birds and fish once filled the Central Valley. We had winter and spring and fall and different kind of hydrologic dynamics playing out. We know that our rivers would spill up onto banks and water would spread out on the floodplains. We know that those floodplains generated food and sanctuary for nature. And we know because of the last couple of decades that there's a strong scientific basis that demonstrates the value of reconnecting rivers to floodplains. And this is proving especially true for young salmon because they feed in that shallow, food-rich habitat type. The reality is it's super challenging to do restoration. You've got access dynamics, often there are real estate elements involved. You have to do significant engineering and designing, contracting, and you need a willing landowner for producing this kind of large change. We've got to do this.
On the eastern edge of the delta is the Shingle Springs Band of the Miwok, one of the tribes that once thrived in the abundant estuary. Every August, they host Big Time, a week-long powwow gathering of California natives. All day and through most of the night, young men, old men, women and children share skills, sing, pray, and dance. With reverence, they dress in the same crowns, robes, and regalia that their ancestors wore at least 2,000 years before Rome had a bishop. Walking around the vendor booths, I met Jeremy Joseph Pacanum, a Madu artist who made tools from animal bones and knives from raw minerals.
You are seeing California Indian art Post-contact, so that's where you get the metal blades instead of the obsidian. The pewter is real pewter, a mixture of tin and lead that I have to melt down and make myself these days because everything is lead-free in this day and age.
What appeared to be craft or tools for off-grid survival was really evidence of hours, sometimes years, of experiential lessons in history, ecology, biology, physics, and chemistry.
Even the brass tacks that you see on my artwork are the original square-shanked, sand-cast brass tacks from the 1840s through the 1870s. So they're period brass tacks that we used to get off of stagecoach furniture and whatnot by any means necessary, basically. The sinew that you see, this is animal tendon that's been dried and processed, mixed with hide glue, and it shrinks and binds, and this is how we attach bone to stone. This is our all-purpose, basically fiberglass, Indian fiberglass.
Jeremy had to learn how to hunt and debone an elk, how to process a deer hide using animal brains, and how to smelt pewter from tin and lead. The canon of his experiences is called Traditional Ecological Knowledge, or TEK, tech. Other tech booths had demonstrations for kids. They identified trees and grasses, and they understood their cellular structure well enough to make string, rope, and waterproof baskets. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service defines traditional ecological knowledge as different from Western science in that it's a holistic approach. It uses data from people who use natural resources and tries to integrate it into daily life. The tribe also sees it as a path to cultural identity and a way to raise consciousness. They interpret the landscape more as a cohabitant than as a resource.
That's an awesome plant.
Melissa Teaba is the tribe's vice chair and director of traditional ecological knowledge.
Traditional knowledge is going to save the Delta. It's taking the landscape and doing what it's naturally supposed to do. And I think that what happened is as the state progressed, I just don't think that they saw land the way we did.
You know, in the Central Valley, you'll hear of the Gallery riparian forest that lined the rivers.
Allison Whipple is the science director for the Resilient Landscapes program at the San Francisco Estuary Institute. In 2012, Whipple's team published an ecological history of the Delta. It was funded by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, which discovered that it didn't really know what the original Delta looked like. It needed a baseline reference. Whipple and her team at the Institute brought together more than 3,000 historical sources from the archives of early European settlers. What she found and then visualized was an abundant freshwater landscape that was almost immediately commodified.
It actually was really quite convenient for farmers in the early days that they could, use the tides actually to irrigate their lands. They could put up, flashboards on the sloughs to prevent water when they didn't want it to come on. And then when they wanted to flush it, they could open up those gates and the tides would naturally bring water onto their land.
One of the biggest environmental consequences came from the removal of tule grass in the central delta, which grew in layers over centuries and built up into a rich soil called peat.
They'd use steamrollers, but they'd also use sheep and other methods to remove the tule in the kind of the initial clearing. And also early in the reclamation days, there was a lot of burning of the tules. The fire would actually often get into the peat itself and burn, feet worth of peat in a matter of a very short while.
Carson Jeffries is a fish biologist and a senior research ecologist at the UC Davis Center for Watershed Sciences.
The reason that this land has subsided is as it was developed and started being used for agriculture, that peat started being oxidated. And then we've been giving off methane and carbon. And over the last 100 years of that process is as we've kind of slowly worked that peat, it keeps on getting lower and lower and lower, and then slowly going off, is off-gassing. So they have a drainage system in all of the levees. They're constantly pumping water back into the channels. Because some of them are 30 feet below sea level. So when you're on one side of the levee, it's dry land, but it's 30 feet up to the water, particularly down in the Western Delta. The levees are just riprap rock channels. and that's not what they looked like historically. And we've really lost the habitat that is in that space within the rock channels isn't the habitat that most fish need.
Not all of the delta is dramatically subsided, but it is sinking. In its pre-industrial condition, the Sacramento Valley was a region ravaged in floods. Every winter in the rainy season, it formed an inland sea, 100 miles long, that drained slowly away in the summer months. Tayaba's ancestral family would migrate to high ground near Sacramento when the waters were high, and they lived together in a permanent roundhouse. They spent the winter resting and telling stories, crafting clothes and tools. In the summer, they ventured out into the natural levees of the delta and lived in temporary shelters made of tule reeds and willow.
We're taught that you never leave a plant the way you found it, you make it better. Whether that's fluffing the dirt, taking off the dead parts, that plant's going to grow better.
They set fish and bird traps. They harvested berries and medicine.
We don't even realize the awesome diet that they had because we were just cut off from all of that. I actually think that's why, a lot of people in my community actually suffer from things like diabetes.
The gold rush displaced Tayaba's family, scattering them and other tribes across California.
My people were homeless for years. We didn't even get to this till the end of the 70s. We were poor people. And when I say we came from the dirt, I'm telling the truth. We came from nothing.
The surviving members of the Delta tribes preserved traditional ecological knowledge that could be used today for restoration efforts. A new water quality control plan is being decided this year. Back in 2020, federal, state, and local agencies agreed to a set of goals for an 8-year transformation of the Delta. It includes a promise for 750,000 acre-feet of additional freshwater flows to help recover fish populations. But the water agencies are making their own plans for habitat restoration. Melissa told me that she and other tribes were only recently approached for feedback. Allison, can you tell me a little bit about what restoration looks like? How is it done?
So there are experiments on Twitchell Island is the one that's kind of most prominent in terms of doing tule farming, basically trying to regain elevation through growing tule and trying to accrete that peat back that we'd lost. But it's, centimeters per year, so that would take many decades, if not more, centuries to regain up to an intertidal range that tule could be able to establish in. But really, we can think about the margins of the delta with sea level rise, where there's opportunities to be able to have those transition zones where we are able to let tidal water reach those extents that over time, those can recover and be maybe more reflective of what the central delta historically looked like.
While Allison's research informs changes to the landscape, Carson sees restoration from the perspective of the fish.
So the idea of this is to create this shallow inundated habitat in both a floodplain and an intertidal spot, so the tide goes in and out. The processes that we want to have in there are really zooplankton, phytoplankton, so food for juvenile fish in particular, and fish that rely on intertidal and floodplain habitats are habitats that are greatly lacking in the delta right now.
If we have, the combination of sea level rise, a high tide, a king tide event, and a major storm kind of all coming together and some major levee breaks in some key locations, it would be freshwater, and there'd be a lot of freshwater that's heading into the bay and out. However, after the flood peak has passed and those levees are broken, that would mean that salinity could shift into the delta, so in the dry season.
But what happens when those levees fail now, when they're 30 feet below sea level, is you don't have a marsh anymore. You just have a lake. And that lake is predominantly going to be occupied by non-native species. And it's not super productive.
When those floods come through, the depth of water is too great for vegetation to be able to reestablish.
Okay, so then you get a lake. What's wrong with a lake?
So then you have a different landscape. It comes to a question of, are we trying to put the landscape into a trajectory that is more supportive for native species and also one that we think is going to be more resilient and able to adapt to climate change in the future? Or are we going to let these sort of novel ecosystems go how they may as we continue on our business as usual path?
Let's sing a water song. The rain, the snow, and the river, the water. And we'll call it Lamu, is land of the rivers. That's us all right here in Northern California. We got some of the best water. So good that we got to fight to keep it. So this song is praying for everybody's water, all of us, not just our village. So this song's for everybody. Pray for that water. Give thanks. Oh.
Tayaba and I sat together in a circle of benches, the kind of social arrangement you might find in a Shaker meeting house. The smell of hardwood smoke filled the air. One of the Delta tribes entered the circle and began to perform. They wore handmade orange masks that mimicked the flicker woodpecker. The singer was Petey Ramirez. His message, see the gifts of the Creator and give thanks. There is no ancient text, but the Sanskrit for this worship is the landscape. Without the flora and the fauna of the Delta, the tribe would lose its religion.
You see some of the feathers coming off the back. Traditionally, those are magpie feathers. Boys are supposed to be wearing magpie feathers. But where can you get a bunch of magpies?
Do you ever feel like you were born in the wrong time?
Yes, and I'd pay a lot of money just to go back into that time. Yes.
I might join you.
Just to get a glimpse. Don't you just want to see? Even if it's only like 15 minutes or I just want to see it with my own eyes.
Tribal water right is a nuanced beneficial use, and one that's difficult to explain to the State Water Resources Control Board. Asking for native trees and grasses is like asking for everything. But some plans for nature-based restoration projects are happening now.
But right now, what we're doing is also just a hodgepodge of management that is total triage. We triage drought, we triage flood, we triage, when levees fail. And the thing that gets me when I think about this is that the environment always loses in triage. We are very much just put Band-Aids on things and don't deal with the actual solutions. I think that that's a pretty common thing right now. Sometimes a lack of imagination gets us stuck in purgatory.
Non-native people may not understand that the earth is alive, that water is alive. I mean, I just call it white mentality because it's a box. Everything's been cut into all of these boxes, including the river.
I love fish. I spend my time fishing. I eat fish. I spend my time with my head underwater counting fish. But there's a different kind of connection with fish that the tribe has. I just want to have a floodplain connected to a river. I'm not even asking for very much, let alone think about how we value the river, the value that it brings to us as humanity. It is one thing to be to a manager, be I need to do this because we get more fish. It's another thing to do that, I need to do this because it's good for everybody. They're well, you can't quantify that. It's really hard. And that is the space that I currently live in, and I struggle with it every day.
Felicia, I picture Carson, this scientist, standing with his feet in the water, feeling the same kind of frustrations we might hear coming from a medical doctor whose decisions are dictated by insurance codes. The scientific system he's in leaves no room for the philosophical work of recalibrating our relationship to nature.
Well, I agree with you. I think that if you look at the last 150 years, it's as if we've forgotten everything that everybody once knew about the connectedness of all things. tribes have never forgotten. But also, there's a growing honoring of traditional ecological knowledge that at the international level, perhaps even more so than at the national or the state level, being able to apply that respect and knowledge for co-management and for things to the Delta would be a wonderful thing.
One last question before we go. I know that there's no way to turn back the clock on the Delta, but when we bring in the environmental engineering crews and the backhoes and we mechanically reshape the land into a tidal plain, are we really restoring the Delta, or are we just constructing a silhouette of what it once was?
If you did more of that to reconnect floodplains, as opposed to having high levee walls everywhere, you create ecosystem benefits all the way around that technically wouldn't take quite as much water. And that's if you combine increased flows and habitat restoration, we have a shot at being able to maximize the benefit for species and for human uses.
Well, thank you, Felicia, for that hopeful image to end on. For Bay City News, I'm Ruth Dusseault.